Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And as we've just heard, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a crisis not just for global public health, but for social and economic prospects worldwide. And these interrelated crises are building on existing inequalities, and they're making them worse. And as we're going to hear from our panellists, they're hitting the poorest the hardest. So even though we have been in lockdown, the challenge of sustainable development has not. And so as we've heard in previous seminars in this series, climate change, conflict, violent extremism, humanitarian emergencies have not gone away. So not only were we already off track by the end of 2019 with the Sustainable Development Goals and the related Agenda 2030 commitments on climate and development finance, the COVID pandemic has put us further off track, as we've just heard from Jean-Marc, and as is set out in the UN Secretary General's response, these socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. They're attacking every single target, they threaten every single goal. And as you'll hear in this seminar, inequality has made it worse. The differential impact of the crisis on the haves and the have-nots is widening existing inequalities, and it threatens the life chances of future generations too. So in this context, many voices are calling for a short-term focus only on the economic and the health fallout from COVID, so emphasising domestic rather than multilateral action. And certainly as economies go into recession, we can expect to see aid budgets shrink and to see resources shifted into the search for a vaccine at the expense of other SDGs. And in fact, even those who fully support Agenda 2030 are suggesting that the deadline for the SDGs should be delayed by 2 years or more. But this misses the point. In fact, the Sustainable Development Agreements that make up Agenda 2030 are needed now more than ever before. So I'm going to outline a few issues to explain why these agreements are the roadmap out of the crisis. So firstly, it's important to remember where the SDGs come from. They emerged from decades of global commitments on all aspects of development. And they were preceded by the Millennium Development Goals, which were kind of accidentally invented by the OECD because they wanted to keep a tally on the number of commitments made at UN conferences from Rio to Beijing to Cairo and more. And the MDGs actually set some goals for development assistance. So they mark the beginning of global governance for international collaboration and international cooperation after the end of the Cold War. So the SDGs built on this, and the core agreements on sustainable development, climate and financing for development that make up Agenda 2030 encompass the MDGs, as well as associated agreements on humanitarian assistance, resilience, small island developing states and more. But crucially, the SDGs brought in the voice of citizens, including youth, and they also brought in business. So while the final agreements were hammered out in New York, Addis and Paris, they were shaped by people. And as you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, more than 7 million people from all parts of the world contributed to the My World Survey 2015 that helps to frame the SDG agenda. And we can see from the results of that survey on the left and from the SDGs on the right, what actually matters to people. We can see that people care about a good education for their children, healthcare, job opportunities, nutritious food, honest, responsive government. They care about fairness and inclusion. They support the commitment to leave no one behind. And on this slide, we can see Parisians cheering health workers. We can see protests in Malawi about the lack of protective equipment for doctors and nurses. And we can see that, ironically, 2020 is the year of the nurse. But these images underline the fact that people are still concerned about issues of fairness today. They're concerned that we don't value our frontline workers, that the poorest are losing the most, and that our children's health, education and life opportunities will suffer. So the SDGs are definitely still valid for a post-COVID roadmap. And getting back to that proposal that we delay the SDG target date, we can't do that. It's not the Eurovision Song Contest. It's not a fixed amount of work. It's a transformation. And this slide is to remind us that probably most importantly, we must not treat lightly, we must not dismiss the legitimacy of Agenda 2030. So for all the challenges of unwillingness to cooperate internationally around climate action, financing for development, or gender equality that we see today, we shouldn't forget that these agreements in 2015 drew support from 193 world leaders. So not only are they based on decades of globally negotiated UN conventions, with inputs from millions of citizens, businesses and investors worldwide, and a universal approach that applies equally to rich and poor countries, they were backed at the highest level by pretty much every single nation on earth. Even if we thought we could do better, we would never be able to achieve an agreement of this scale and ambition today. And there are huge risks to global security of undermining what is the most legitimate global social contract we have ever had. And it's one that enshrines the commitment to reduce inequalities in Goal 10. We have one chance to build back after COVID-19, and Agenda 2030 is the roadmap. And I've included this slide, this quote, which was in the Guardian newspaper in March. It was a letter from an Italian author in lockdown to the British population and highlighting the challenges to come. And it captures how COVID is widening social rifts and inequalities. So we've all been in this together, and we now realise how much we rely on each other for health and well-being. But we emerge from lockdown with vastly different prospects, shaped by pre-existing inequalities. And as Francesca says, class, however, will make all the difference. The boat in which you'll be sailing in order to defeat the epidemic will not look the same to everyone, and is actually not the same for everyone. It never was. So many people will come out of lockdown, they'll have lost everything. And without rapid action, the same goes for their children. And that is a major threat to global security. And so with no vaccine in sight, we're entering a period of uncertainty. And as this slide illustrates, there are new crises to come. And there will be a need for all citizens to make further sacrifices for the sake of everybody's health and well-being. Just this week, the World Economic Forum warned of the risk to global security of inaction. And they've stressed that we don't have time to plan, we need to act. So the world needs a roadmap now that speaks to all of us. Unfortunately, we don't have to wait, and we don't have to ask permission. We already have this roadmap in Agenda 2030. It's big, it's bold, it's ambitious, and it's legitimate. So let's use it. Thank you.